Hello and welcome to episode 131 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, I wasn't expecting this much activity, but we have a lot of rumors, a lot of reports going around the CDL, and a lot of potential RosterMania. And you know how people said that this might be the worst RosterMania potentially because of the Sports World Cup? I think that these reports are kind of saying the opposite. But before we get into any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. We're officially in football season, so it's good to have that back. And yeah, kind of like you said, not a ton of confirmed action, but it seems like we've got enough reports and reports of reports getting closer to fruition. So it seems like we're finally getting into the nitty gritty of roster mania a little bit more, and we got a bunch to talk about. So might as well hop right in.
Yeah, like I said, when people were talking about the Esports World Cup, because there was a mini roster mania period before that tournament, people kind of hypothesized that maybe this actual roster mania before the new CDL season would be kind of shortened or abbreviated, something along those lines. It wouldn't be nearly as eventful because there was already action before. At least with this one team, there's so many dominoes that can spring off of this. A report from, I believe, Jacob Hale, Breaking Point, Hydra, Scrap, Envoy, and Ghosty are exploring the idea of teaming together and potentially for the Los Angeles Thieves, which we have talked about so much in the past about how LAT publicly, not even privately, publicly said that they wanted to be a profitable esports business, that they were willing to not be as competitive in the Call of Duty League if it meant being profitable or not losing nearly as much. This would probably be one of the more expensive rosters that you could create in the CDL. And this is one of the best rosters, on the other hand, that you could create in the CDL. So I want to get your initial reaction to those four players, Hydra, Scrap, Envoy, and Ghosty, exploring the idea of building a super team on the Los Angeles Thieves.
Yeah, there's a lot more to the whole situation,
Mm-hmm.
seemingly to potentially another organization trying to swoop in and target Hydra and Scrap too. But in terms of getting our listeners up to date, like this was really the first major bombshell over the last couple weeks that dropped and got the gears turning, so to say, on Roster Mania. Um, just the thought of Hydra or Scrap, like one of them being a quote unquote free agent or just like available for acquisition, however you want to phrase it. Just one of them potentially being available in this offseason would have been like a major domino to fall that just triggered a whole bunch of stuff. Both of them potentially being on the move, and not only on the move, but potentially going to the same place and teaming together. That's just like, that out of respect for Adrian Wojnarowski retiring, that's as close to a Woj bomb as we've seen in a while. So, um, yeah, I mean, the when the initial report dropped, I was very skeptical, simply because of everything we've talked about and heard over the last couple of years about 100 Thieves and LA Thieves as an organization trying to be profitable, cutting costs this last season, and when you think about it even more, like 2022 they win the world championship, have their 2023 roster is that 2022 team of Kenny, Envoy, Draza, and Octane. Obviously, Octane retires, but they move on from those other three parts of the World Championship winning roster to seemingly rebuild and have a cheaper roster. And then only 1 year after that, it seems like they're potentially exploring going back to spending a ton, because we haven't heard specific numbers in any of these reports of what the buyouts would be or what the contracts or salaries would be, but it is just everyone's assumption that especially Hydra and Scrap would be very expensive players to acquire from a buyout standpoint and be able to salary on your team. um so it seems like I would, Nadeshot's gone on stream a couple times since these reports come out and has said don't get too excited because these leaks like put me in a position where if it doesn't happen, like everyone's gonna be upset with me, all this stuff, and like on once if it is confirmed and this move happens for 100 Thieves as a roster, I will really look forward to hearing what Nadeshot or the organization has to say about it, its outlook on spending in esports, all that stuff. So that's one aspect of it that I'm interested in. But just yeah, on paper for a roster, this is immediately a top three roster in the game in my eyes. Um, the one thing that I feel like some people will um, not be super enthused by the Envoy aspect of the roster just because he seemed to have a bit of a down year this past season, at least statistically speaking. Um, but I think, especially when you have a guy like Hydra, like having someone like Envoy who's going to do the dirty work and all that stuff around the map that needs to be done, it'd be similar to Kismet's role that he played in the sub duo with the subliners and Hydra there. So I think that works out well, or it should at least on paper. The other aspect here that I feel like isn't really being talked about is just Ghosty. We really talked. I mean, before last season, when he was in Challengers, he's dropping massive KD numbers, goes on Optic, and he just didn't have to be that guy for Optic. He got to be the guy who, he could make the winning plays. He just had the superstars around him, and he didn't have to go out and drop a 1.4. And then this past season, we see him once again revert to what we had heard about him in Challengers, being that all-star caliber player, you know, basically the face of the LAT team and their most productive player. And now if the super team comes to 100 Thieves, it feels like he can slot back into a role similar to what we saw in Optic, and it's just a question of, to me, what is the best version of Dan Ghosty that we're going to see or get. And it's awesome for him as a player, like that he's selfless enough and able to do that. And I think that's really going to be an unspoken reason why, if this team comes to fruition, it could see success, because even in real sports, and you look at like your big threes and stuff, like there are multiple experiments where you try to throw a ton of superstars together and it just doesn't end up working because like basketball, everybody wants to take the shot and all that stuff, for lack of better examples. But in this case, like, you're getting 3 world champions and Dan Ghosty, who, just a couple months ago, we were having a debate on this podcast about whether he should or should not have been voted as an all-star for the past season. It's a super talented roster put together, but that's where obviously another question would be, how will Scrap and Hydra work together? That I just think they're super talented and they'd be able to figure it out. But at the same time, yeah, I think Ghosty is that interesting piece here. And like I said, we've seen him do the superstar role, dropping those 1.4 KDs. We've seen him make the winning plays on a team like Optic, where he doesn't have to be the standout superstar slayer. What are we going to see from him on this team if it comes to fruition?
Ghosty is by far the most underrated part of this. Obviously,
Yes.
Envoy, I think, is just, his stock is very low, and I think that is what it is. He didn't have a particularly great season this past year, but from what we have seen in previous seasons, we should have the expectation that he's going to be a good, effective part of this roster. But for Ghosty, this is a massive vote of confidence, so to speak, from the Los Angeles Thieves, or I guess 100 Thieves at this point, that they believe in Ghosty. We talked about it when 100 Thieves, they got, I believe, got second at Esports World Cup. We thought, okay, what is the ceiling of this roster? Do you run it back with this team? Because there is so much momentum at the end of the season for that particular team. But we both agreed that just on paper, their roster did not match up with Optic, who won the World Championship, did not match up with FaZe, who had a disappointing end to the season, but definitely are one of the most talented teams that you could possibly put together. and the debate was, do you make a roster change? You try to improve your team around Ghosty. They did. If this roster comes to be and 100 Thieves signs Scrappy, Hydra, and Envoy to replace his Ghosty's three teammates, that is as much confidence as you can possibly have in a guy that we're willing to throw aside some of the reservations that we had about spending big money or even trying to go outside of our organization and pull in players because they were in a rebuilding process. They brought in young guys that they thought they could either rebuild after disappointing seasons or build up just as young guys that needed more reps at the CDL level. And now they're in a completely different phase. I think of it as like 2014 Cleveland Cavaliers, where it's like Kyrie Irving, Deion Waiters, and Tristan Thompson, and all the young guys for the Cavs. And then LeBron signs that are like, all right, Mike Miller, James Jones, like all of our 35-year-old guys that we believe can win a championship. They're in a completely different phase right now, it seems, if this roster is it does come true, I should say. But that's a huge development, and I think this roster could have so many different domino effects because it's affecting so many different teams. You have obviously Scrappy and Envoy that would be coming from Toronto, and we'll get to it in a minute, but their owner talking about kind of the financial impact of that. And Hydra, of course, coming from C9 or New York. And that 2 years ago, they win, or a year ago, they win the World Championship. They make a roster change between seasons, which is very rare. And now it looks like that team is obliterated. It doesn't seem like that team can actually have a path forward. And I don't know what to really say about that. I did see, I don't know if you saw, but Jack he went on Reddit and he said, it's been a complex offseason. I plan to fully keep the roster for next year, but the players have asked for changes. I'm doing my best to accommodate their asks while building a team of players that want to play together. I'm not looking to make a cash grab, and I am willing to spend. I'm not going to force players to play where they don't want to be. And he said another comment, my first move is fully run it back with the same roster. My second move has been to support the players and coaches. It has been very complex and difficult to achieve those goals. Another part of this was D-Real announcing that he was open to new possibilities and new opportunities. This report from Jacob Hale was that Sender, who had been part of the New York coaching staff the last few seasons, he would be targeted as the new coach for this 100 Thieves roster, replacing JCap, who had announced his departure from the organization earlier this offseason. So many moving parts. Just to hone in on that New York Cloud9 front, what do you think is the path forward for them? Because losing your best player, and not just your best player, but literally one of, if not the best player in the world, that completely changes what you're doing. Kind of on an opposite level as 100 Thieves. They believed in Ghosty so much that they're like, all right, let's go and try to compete. Losing Hydra for New York or Cloud9, that has to make them think, okay, we have to rebuild, right? I don't know, what would, if you were the GM of Cloud9 or you were Jack, what are you doing now that it looks like your best player is leaving?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tricky situation. I saw a lot of comments of like, uh, people basically saying like, if C9 was gonna let Hydra go, why didn't they take the spot of another team that didn't have these players, like stuff like that. And it's like, it feels like this is something that just kind of happened in the off season where seemingly Hydra didn't want to play with these guys anymore, and now he's like making moves elsewhere. And um, throughout Cloud9's history, at least my understanding, and in other esports and stuff, it feels like C9 Jack has been a very player-oriented owner and CEO, and willing to, move on from players. The big example, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this last time or one of our last episodes, was Perks for C9. They gave him like a $6 million contract. To come over to North America from Europe, and it was like a 2 or 3 year deal, I believe, and he only ended up playing 1 year for C9. It was like, I'm homesick, I want to go back to Europe, and Obviously don't know the terms of the contract and it ending and whatnot, but Jack, allowed him to go back to Europe and wasn't like, no, you signed a contract, you're staying here against your will sort of thing. So, um, feels like C9 is in a tough position because of this Hydra decision. Um, Jack saying he's willing to spend is interesting. It's just a question of with guys like Hydra and Scrap moving on and potentially looking at other opportunities, like who is there for C9 to spend on. Um, One potential name that comes to mind for me, not necessarily at the caliber of player of Hydra or Scrap yet, but someone like Gwyn. We've heard the reports earlier this offseason of potentially Carolina, uh, Royal Ravens looking to exit the CDL or sell its spot, and there were names like Fnatic and Gen G being thrown around as being interested in acquiring a CDL spot. Um, if that's possible, it could be, a way if C9 is willing to spend that they get the reigning rookie of the year from Carolina, and the Royal Ravens organization gets a little bit of money back before exiting. That could be one potential avenue. The other name that it seems like he's most likely not coming back, but Sib. Haven't heard a ton of what's going on with Sib since he announced that he's a restricted free agent, but then it's a question of was like Sib and Hydra having issues and they didn't want to play together, or was it Sib clashing with Kismet and Skies who are still on C9? Because if that's the case, then he's most likely not going back. So C9 is in that spot where Jack's saying he's willing to spend. It's just a question of if Scrap and Hydra do go to another team together, who is there for C9 to spend on? It would be interesting to see what they were able to make happen, but it very well could be a scenario where they have to enter a little bit of a rebuild. And if they're also in a position where D-Real is gone, if Sender leaves too, going to be looking for a coach slash GM. Like obviously, Jack isn't necessarily, he's been in COD before, but he's not like the guy right now who I would expect to be like heavily scouting challengers players and be like, oh, this is the next up and comer, I'm going to grab him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting position for New York slash C9 to be in, especially pretty exciting time for C9 fans to have them come in and enter the CDL, return to competitive Call of Duty, and now all this offseason stuff. It's like, we're potentially in a position where they enter the league with grabbing a top 4 roster, and now they could be middle of the pack team depending on who they're able to sign.
Welcome to COD C9. This is how it works. Typically not in one fell swoop, but it does seem like it's a domino effect. Even if Sib is not a part of this roster, like if Hydra doesn't want to be there, then everything changes. You really don't have like a suitable replacement, at least I can think of. Without him, like you really don't know what the potential of your roster is. I think with him, there was always kind of like a built-in floor, but you really don't know what that is without one of the best players. It's kind of like if Simp leaves FaZe, like even with the other guys, like I'm not sure even like a really good replacement. I'm not sure how much effect that could have. But that's just one of the things that's been happening over the past few weeks. Another one was Gentlemates potentially acquiring Los Angeles Guerrillas spot. Of course, Gentlemates, as we talked about, I believe, before the Esports World Cup, that's Gotaga's organization. Gotaga, one of the more famous, probably the most famous French Call of Duty player, definitely, I think, the most popular historically. Probably him and Hydra. I think Gotaga is probably more popular because he's kind of like their Scump or Nade Shot, but it looks like this could be a way out for LAG, which has been pretty much in purgatory or a limbo for the last few years. And we had talked about how the layoffs had affected them, and they did not go to the Esports World Cup. They were the only CDL team not to attend. But Gentlemates appears like they could be coming into the CDL. What do you think about that? This potential new organization coming in and making a splash, I guess. I don't know if they have any plans to be more than the LA Gorillas, because they were at times
Well,
kind of hit or miss on their roster stuff.
that's the most interesting wrinkle here is that they are potentially targeting Hydra and Scrap too. So if they swoop in, grab the CDL spot from LAG, and are able to, you know, steal them away from 100 Thieves or LAT, then that's another just massive domino in uh, RosterMania, because then you have 100 Thieves in a position where they seemingly do want to spend a lot, and then where do they go from there if they don't get Hydra and Scrap? The latest rumblings, I believe, from Jacob Hale are that Scrap and Envoy are very close in the buyout process to going to 100 Thieves, but we haven't heard that same language around Hydra. And we have talked about this going back many years now to the Paris Legion days, and Gotaga's just who he is, basically French Nate Shot is who I like to think of him as, and at least in my mind that's the closest comparison I can make. Um, you get a team owned by someone like him with a French fandom, and you're able to make a splash by getting the French phenom. Like, that's something it's very hard to pass up if it's actually feasible, and that could cause Gentlemates and 100 Thieves to enter a bit of a bidding war. And again, we've already talked about 100 Thieves and their potential in you know potential to not want to spend as much as they have in previous years. So if they enter a bidding war where Gentlemates is driving the price up, how much higher is 100 Thieves going to want to go? Like, it's a very interesting wrinkle in the whole RosterMania thing. Now, from what we've heard in the reports, it does feel like Scrap and Hydra do want to play together. So I don't know how likely it is for, let's just say, lack of a better example here, Scrap goes to 100 Thieves and Hydra goes to Gentlemates. I don't know how likely that is, but the whole dynamic here of Gentlemates entering the CDL in that LAG spot and trying to make a splash by getting an MVP player, an all-star like Hydra, that's just something that's very interesting and exciting, especially if you're a European or a French fan of Call of Duty. Like, feels like that's like a slam dunk if from a branding perspective, if they're able to do it. Again, I don't even know the financials behind like Gentlemates as an organization, let alone what we've heard of 100 Thieves and what they're willing to spend. But yeah, it's just that's a especially into compared to LAG, like staying in the league and waiting till the very end to throw a roster together, and the whole situation we had this last year. It would be very different if we get a new organization replacing them and seemingly entering this sort of bidding war or sort of battle for the top players to try and acquire them. Really exciting opportunity there if it does come to fruition. But again, this is just a report.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard, like I just said a couple minutes ago, names like Fnatic and Genji. I think even like Space Station Gaming and Liquid. Like, we've heard a ton of names potentially interested in entering the CDL. It feels like this Gentlemates report is like the most recent and like actually reported. It feels like more of a report than and less of a rumor. But again, none of it's confirmed, so we're gonna have to wait and see how it shakes out. But really interesting development, and it could throw a wrinkle in the plans for this 100 Thieves super team that's also seemingly in the works.
This is just another part of the theme, and I mentioned this before we went live with the show, that the theme of the off season really seems to be like how much are you dedicated financially to what you're doing. And this is on like a CDL level, this is on like the individual teams. How much are you willing to spend, and who's going to be like the most all in with the money? So you have teams that in the past, like the Las Vegas Legion, rest in peace, The LAG was kind of, like I said, hit or miss. Like they offered those 2-year contracts after they went to like Spart and Arcides, or I think there were 3-year contracts, excuse me, and it looked like okay they're really committed, and then like 3 months later they were laying off people, and those contracts seemed to be kind of getting washed away. So there were teams that were definitely kind of all in, wanted to spend kind of big to hopefully win big. And then there were organizations that did not want to do that, and we had the haves and have-nots, and it seems like that is changing. Those teams are changing. You get gentlemates who could come in and they could maybe make some splash signings and really change the dynamic. And then you have Toronto, who I would consider has been kind of a big spender, at least more recently. They brought in Envoy. They got some big name free agents and have developed players well, but they've kept together an all-star roster, so to speak. But that seems like that is also changing because Adamau, I'm not sure how to say his last name. Apologies if I just butchered that, but he is the CEO of Overactive Media, which owns the Toronto Ultra and the Defiant and the Overwatch League and KOI, I think, and Mad Lions and all that stuff. But he said on Twitter, there's been a lot of speculation, but I'm not going to confirm or deny anything right now. For the CDL, we simply can't sustain the contracts we have. They were made under different circumstances in the prior CDL model, and the best path forward is to reset and let everyone explore their options. He goes on to say, we lowered buyouts dramatically to give them the freedom to choose their next steps, and many have already done so. He said, it's kind of challenging to be in Canada, higher taxes, and, the Toronto Raptors, when they were definitely an expansion team, have dealt with that in the past. But he says, for those disappointed by changes in the roster, I ask that you trust us. Over 6 years, we've delivered unforgettable moments, and we learned that giving players flexibility is key to long-term success. So I think that's really interesting that they have lowered their buyouts to help facilitate these moves. That might help a team like 100 Thieves in theory if they're trying to get 2 of Toronto's players on their team, 2 players that you would expect to generate high buyouts with Scrappy and Envoy. I think that's a good move. That's a ethically good move to help out players to find a better solution or find a better place for them. And I want to get your thoughts in general about that, about a team like Toronto. And this was something that we thought was happening with 100 Thieves. It did happen for maybe a season where they're saying, we're going to scale back. We're going to be more responsible with our money. What do you think about Toronto choosing to do that at this point?
I mean, I think it makes sense. I mean, especially just the landscape of esports in general, it makes a lot of sense for these teams to try to do it. It's just going to be a question of how effective they're able to do it. And what I mean by that is there's obviously, just for lack of a better example, because we've been talking about them, like 100 Thieves, they enter a rebuild this past season. We don't know the numbers, but it's pretty safe to say they spent substantially less on its 2024 roster than it did on the 2022-2023 roster. And they didn't see immediate success, but especially towards the end of the year, they get 3rd at champs, I believe, or 4th at champs, and 2nd at the Esports World Cup to end the season. Like they played their best COD at the end of the year. I've said it numerous times on this podcast. That's what you want to do. You want to be playing your best COD at the end of the year when you're playing in the biggest tournaments for the most prize money. And if you're able to do a rebuild and see that success, especially for an organization that has seen so much success in the CDL already, like Toronto, then that's what you're looking to do. For a team like Toronto, they don't want to enter a rebuild and just come in last place this year, because that would be a dramatic step back for the organization, results wise and fan wise and all that stuff. But for Toronto in particular, that we've already seen, like from the very inception of the CDL, they were like, I'm pretty sure the only team to do the 10-man roster at the start when it was 5v5, and they were like we've talked about it on the pod before about teams potentially getting to a point where they have like academy teams and uh they're able to scrim against each other and all that stuff, and like they really seemingly fully bought into that, and they were using their quote unquote academy team or their B squad, whatever you want to call it, during that MW 2019 season, and bringing multiple players up. Someone like Kleenex, who I did Kleenex start the Kleenex might have started the first season in the starting roster. I don't know if he did. But
Honestly,
anyway,
cannot remember.
I know it was the two. It was Lucky Metals were in there with Looney, Methods, and Classic, I want to say. So I don't think Kleenex did. Um, but anyway, I lost my train of thought. Regardless, I just think overall, Toronto, we have seen them be successful in forming rosters, and even someone like Scrap, who was like on its academy team, and they funnel him up into the main roster. Someone like Hicksy, who didn't have a massively long stint with the organization, but they were still they saw immediate success when they were able to bring him in momentarily. I think Toronto will do just fine. It will be interesting to see if they're able to retain Insight and Kleenex. Obviously, especially for me, I think they have to hold on to Kleenex. I think he's a one of a kind player and super talented. It would be a massive mistake if they let him go. But obviously, with contracts, if he's asking for a very lucrative salary and whatnot, then it might make things interesting. But um, regardless, yeah, I do think Toronto as an organization has succeeded in the past through multiple iterations, phases of the CDL, even 5v5 versus 4v4. Like we've seen them succeed with roster building, even when you could say like maybe they didn't make the most popular move in the eyes of the community. So I fully believe they'll be able to still be competitive. It might not be a case of like they're a guaranteed top four team this year, but we'll have to wait and see what they're able to do, who they're able to sign, and what their roster looks like before we can truly make that statement.
The balancing act that they have to do is okay, we don't want to spend this much money. We don't want to spend as much as we have been to try to win championships. But we can't completely decimate our roster and then just field like, just a really dumb team that's not going to do anything and not be remotely competitive, because then you become irrelevant. And that also plays a factor in like, do players want to then go to your team? Do fans want to support your team? And we've seen that the balancing act is really interesting with a lot of these teams. On one end, now you seem like Toronto's like, okay, we're not going to spend as much money. We're willing to get part ways with our own players, our very talented team, in order to kind of satisfy the need to be like financially responsible. On the other end, you have 100 Thieves saying, we were trying that, and now we're actually going in the opposite direction. We're going to spend. We're going to try to build this super team that is going to be, presumably very expensive relative to what we had last year. And in the middle, you have someone like Optic. And the report from CDL Scrim Intel is that Optic, who just won the World Championship this year and undoubtedly have one of, if not the most expensive roster in the CDL, reportedly Optic is asking their players to take a pay cut, which is they're right. They're allowed to ask that. I just find it very interesting the different levels at which teams are at right now. Like you have 100 Thieves they're spending. Toronto is trying to save to for lack of a better term, and then Optic is like, well, we don't want to get rid of our players because that would be really stupid, but we would like our players not to make as much money as they currently do. What do you think about that report? I should say it's not confirmed by any means, but the report, Optic is asking their players to take a pay cut after winning a world championship. What do you think about that?
I think the most or not interesting. Sorry, I mixed up my words there. I think the most important aspect of this is that even if Optic is asking its players to do this, it is very unlikely that we ever get official confirmation of the players themselves taking these pay cuts. Like we probably will never know for sure unless it's through one of these reports, and then it's a question of, you know, just I don't know.
It would
I
have to
feel
end
like
poorly for those players to confirm, I think.
sure. And I just think, I mean, to tie it into, we have FaZe getting rid of Tupac, their S&D coach, due to what he said as budget cuts. And I think that just across, it's not even really COD exclusive, it's just across esports in general. We went through that period where salaries got super, egregious and inflated, however you want to
It's
phrase
a
it.
bubble.
And now they're trying to do some course correction here. And yeah, I really don't have much else beyond that. It feels like that's just where we're at with esports right now. And it could be a lot worse. It could be, not to be super cynical or anything, but like the Overwatch League literally shut down. Like those players weren't taking pay cuts; they're just fully out of paying jobs, unless like there's orgs doing that, whatever the new, I think it's called OWCS or something. Obviously not an Overwatch expert, so I don't know how all that's going down and whatnot, but
Yeah.
even in League of Legends, are seemingly seeing like we've talked about C9. There's reports right now of one of C9's players, Jojo Pune, who's potentially the highest paid player in North America. C9 seemingly looking to get out of his contract, but the term of the report was that he's been fired by C9. I've never heard someone report that an org fired a player, but that's the verbiage that was used. And it's like he apparently had been excessively tardy and late over 40 times throughout this past League of Legends season. And it felt like to me, after hearing that in the video from I Will Dominate, who's a former league pro and a content creator, it felt like to me that that's what, like, there was the reports of Jojo Pune potentially being the highest paid player in North America. And it feels like C9 might be using this tardiness as a way to try and get out of the current contract with him and potentially change its deal. So it just feels like across esports right now, not only in COD, is they're trying to be some course correction on salaries and how much money teams are being spent, just because it's so hard for teams to seemingly bring in money through esports at this point.
Yeah, it's a bubble. Like there's no other way to put it. It happens in a lot of industries. It probably happens in every industry at some point. But for esports, there was a bubble kind of building from like 2017 or so. Like it just felt like you're seeing more non-endemic brands. You're getting these franchise leagues, which are generating. We even seen in the CDL. 25, $35 million per team, which we said at the time is ridiculous. None of these teams are worth 25, $35 million. And, they didn't end up having to pay that, fortunately, I guess. But it was a bubble. It was people coming in, spending a lot of money, thinking that they were on the ground floor of a really lucrative business, that they were going to come in to esports and they were going to spend $30 million, but they were going to make $300 million and everything was going to be perfect. Turns out that's not the case. I think the pandemic had a lot to do with that. That definitely was like a literal needle, just like popping it right there, saying like, actually there are no in-person events now, so any money that you were planning on making on these events not going to be happening. Media rights, we've talked about that in the past. That is another like part of the bubble of like who is going to be paying millions and millions and millions of dollars to the Call of Duty League to broadcast these matches. And some organizations and owners are more willing to take on whatever money that is, and potentially kind of cut off the potential of having more viewers on Twitch. They'd rather go to YouTube and make that money. So all of that is kind of part of just trying to make as much money as possible, which, it's a business, it's whatever, like that's how it is. But we've seen a lot in the last few weeks, unfortunately, people kind of losing their jobs because of these budget cuts or that bubble bursting and teams trying to restrict costs and all that. Like you said, Tupac, the S&D coach for FaZe, he announces he's been released because of budget cuts. Miles Ross, which is a league thing, not a specific team, but Miles Ross, the lead play-by-play commentator for the CDL over the last few years, he was laid off by Microsoft. That just, that it's unfortunate. Like, there's no other way to put it. Like, it sucks for all of these people, and they're not the only ones, because the Boston breach, there's a lot of real kind of uncertainty, I would say, with their organization, because they were reportedly laying off people before the Esports World Cup. You obviously had the Los Angeles Guerrillas. I'm not sure how many people were actually working for the Las Vegas Legion at the time, but you have to think about those people and how that transition is going from being the Legion to the Falcons and all of that. But it's like you said, it's not there's nothing that we can do. Like, we've been supportive of the CDL. We've been talking about the CDL. I have several things of merch from the CDL. I've done my part. I didn't go to an event, but you did. So, like, this podcast at least has done our part, and the diehard fans have done our part. But it does seem like people are going to lose their jobs, and they're going to be pay cuts. The salaries across the league, I think, will, if not, I think they're already going down in general. But I think you will see something like Optic, a team that has historically been known to spend a lot of money, that they're even like, okay, like, this is like a lot. This is more than we can handle, or more than we want to handle at this point. And even though you just won a world championship, let's scale back a little bit in terms of that pay. And I don't think that's unreasonable to ask, because we're always pushing for longevity or security, something like stability. That was the word I was looking for. We're looking for stability in esports and in COD esports, and more reasonable salaries, I think, are expected. That's going to really piss off players, as it probably should, because those guys were coming up thinking, I'm going to make $500,000-$600,000, and then owners are like, actually, we want to be like way less than that. That would make me mad if I was accustomed to that. And you might see more players decide, hey, I'm going to be a streamer, or I'm going to be a content creator, or I'm going to do something else, rather than play for a lot less than I've been accustomed to. But that's just the way of esports. That's how it's going to work. I wouldn't be surprised if a CDL team tried to do what they're doing with that League of Legends player. Like, hey, you've been late to practice like a bunch of times. It says in your contract here that we don't have to pay you if you're late to practice. And I mean, that's stuff that I think every professional sports league goes through. But the CDL and a lot of esports leagues are not they're not unionized, so that makes them pretty susceptible to like mass like layoffs and salary suppression and stuff. So it's going to be interesting. But I think that's just how it works. I don't know if you had any thoughts about, Miles, or more on Tupac, or any of that good stuff.
No, I want to. You kind of mentioned Miles, and I think it was important to, mention his situation now. The big thing here is that him saying his full-time contract with Activision is up, which means his exclusivity with Call of Duty is ended. The important thing to note there is it doesn't necessarily mean Miles won't be casting the CDL next year. We don't know for sure that he will be, but we also it's not guaranteed that he won't be, just because Activision could sign him to a contract for the season, and he could be a contracted commentator instead of a full-time commentator. Also means for him, he could get freelance opportunities for other esports, and Miles is a really funny, entertaining guy. Like, he would be a natural for other broadcasts and stuff in other esports. So could end up being a bit of a silver lining for him in terms of other opportunities down the road. But that's what, to me, it was, after I heard the news, that was immediately reminded me of the Merc and Maven situation a couple years ago now. Maven, in the replies to Miles' tweet announcing this, was saying that it was very different situation, because there was apparently just one person who wanted Merc and Maven gone. But
okay.
Regardless of what the the specific details of both the situations are, obviously Merc and Maven are still around on a contract basis.
Yeah.
After being full-time previously, and it means that Miles potentially will be too. If Miles does end up not getting an offer to commentate this next upcoming season. I think that'd be a massive missed opportunity for the league. Um,
Yeah.
Especially since that Merck and Maven situation, Chance and Miles were seemingly like the go-to
They were the
commentator
top
duo,
pair.
and
Yeah.
they were doing a lot of the grand finals and especially the big matches and stuff. So could be a bit of a shake-up there on the broadcast team if something does happen where Miles isn't here next season. But I just want to say that that's like the most important thing of this is yes, Miles was technically laid off by Microsoft Activision, just means he's no longer full time with them, but we could still have him commentating matches this year, and fingers crossed that we do because I enjoy listening to him.
Yeah, they definitely once Maven and Merck went on like a contract base, then it became the Chance and Miles show. Like those were the top pair. They were advertised as such. They got the grand finals, which Maven and Merck to that point had gotten. So I it maybe that'll change now if Miles is not a full time member. Maybe Activision will try, or Microsoft or whatever will say, okay, let's pull someone else in. They're going to be they're our full time guys, so we're gonna make them the top pair. We'll see how it works out. But like you, I would really like to see Miles continue to cast CDO matches. He's very good at what he does. But like you said, the silver lining, and I think he would be very good in other esports, it doesn't even really have to be esports. Like I think he'd just be good at hosting in general. And we've seen with Puckett, like Puckett is, I believe, on a freelance basis, but he was part of the CDL broadcast as well, returning after a few years away doing the Overwatch League, and Maven and Merc doing their thing, and that's just the way it's probably going to be headed, where there's less full-time people that are like contract exclusive to these big organizations. Like for Microsoft, like they can get most people if they want them, just based on like they can offer more money, but they don't necessarily want some of these people to be around all the time and pay them the benefits that requires, which is that's a very esports thing. Contract based work is very popular nowadays. But I would love to see Miles back. I think Miles and Chance have really gotten a lot better together over the last like 2 or 3 years as well, because they were kind of thrown together in some unusual circumstances originally, but they've done really well, and I would love to see them back for another season. But we'll see. Other stuff that we have not touched on yet. Toronto rumors right now. Insight and Kleenex potentially staying with the Toronto Ultra, according to CDL Scrim Intel. Beans has been listed or been reported as a potential replacement for Scrap on Toronto. And then there's the potential that Real from Miami or Hixie making a return. So Hixie was apparently a target of Seattle's or Vancouver's, I think, at this point. But what do you think about this potential Toronto roster? Obviously, you've said on this podcast about how Kleenex and Insight, but especially Kleenex, are pretty instrumental to this team. Definitely unsung heroes considering how much attention Scrappy got just as a player and a personality. But I think it'd be huge if those two players stayed on the team. What do you think about the potential replacements for Scrappy and Envoy being, guys like Beans, Real, Hixie?
Yeah, I think for me, Hixie makes a lot more sense from a business aspect than just what we have talked about from the comments from the Toronto owner or whatever, CEO, whatever his position was. Jacob Hale 11 hours ago updated the situation saying Real is the number one option for Toronto Ultra. And he had previously said Hixie may no longer be available for Surge as Ultra are interested. This was after he had said Vancouver Surge are potentially targeting Hixie. And then he said, if not Hixie, then Real is the alternate option. So now he had most recently updated this to Real being the number one option. But based on what we heard from the owner and stuff, if Real is, they need to pay a buyout to get him from Miami, that doesn't really align necessarily with what we heard about, trying to cut costs or potentially not spend as much. So that's why someone like Hicksey, who I don't believe would have to pay any sort of buyout for, that makes
Yeah.
a little bit more sense from a business standpoint. I think Beans, Beans has definitely shown some potential over these last couple of years. I don't think he's had the opportunity to start right from the get-go of the season. Pretty sure both times now he's been brought in like during the season. So I'd like to see him get an opportunity to, start right from the jump. And I do think, if they do go down the Hicksey route with Beans, Kleenex, and Insight, that's basically a European roster there, and we've heard a bunch of stuff from European COD fans over the last couple of years about how there's no EU events, there's no real EU team after like London rebranded to Carolina, that sort of thing. So that would be kind of cool from an EU perspective. If that team comes together, we would have the EU team, we would have the Saudi team with Vegas Falcons, we would have the Spanish team with Miami. So we're getting a little bit more global in terms of representation and where the actual teams, I guess, are, just how they're formed and where their players are from. Side note, I didn't put this in the notes, but it's really funny that I heard it yesterday. So the Yankees have been playing the A's this weekend, and the Oakland Athletics are leaving Oakland after the season. They're playing in like a minor league park in Sacramento. And the Yankees broadcast said that after this season, while they're playing in Sacramento, they're not going to be the Sacramento A's.
Yeah.
They are just going to go by the Athletics.
Yep.
And
esports, baby.
I wanted to bring that up because we've talked about the geolocation aspect of CDL and stuff, and I think it's so funny that if MLB, it's been around 100+ years, is willing to have a team like scrap its location-based component of its name and just go by that, then maybe we're getting closer to it happening in the CDL. Obviously, there's no real connection between the two there, but I thought that was funny. It just reminded me.
I mean, granted, that is a weird circumstance that it's unique by itself that they're doing that, and they potentially are trying to get to Las Vegas, but who knows if that'll actually end up happening for them. But I actually wouldn't be too terribly surprised if teams started doing that or eventually did that. I don't think it's like anything soon, but a team like the Cowboys 100% would love to just be like, we're not tied to Dallas necessarily. Like, we'll play our home games there, but like they do their training camp in LA because they're like, well, it's LA. We can be like in the center of attention. Granted, LA did not have any football teams for a while, so they got to kind of like do their own thing. But I think it's something that teams will definitely consider, especially because they've seen how like European soccer clubs have basically like they're able to kind of get outside of the bubble of Europe a lot of times. Like Real Madrid is a big club regardless of if it's actually in Spain. Like they go and play like preseason games and stuff in America, which is, it's weird, I will say. It definitely, if you look at like Reddit or look at Twitter, like when like Real Madrid fans talk about it, they're not happy about that, but like that's just the way things are going. And esports, I mean, I think we've seen that you don't really need to be tied, especially in name, to a place, especially if it's only in name, like some of these CDL teams. So maybe we'll see something change. But that's a good point to bring up. Like maybe traditional sports is catching on. Maybe they don't need the geolocation stuff anymore. Other esports or other COD esports news and notes. Crimp and Nasty potentially going to the Vancouver Surge. And like you said, the Surge were kind of targeting Hicksey as well. In Boston, they are reportedly sticking with, likely to stick with their Esports World Cup roster. They were one of the teams that really made quite a few changes. Snoopy being able to stay on this roster, not saying he deserved it to get dropped or anything, but this was, I think, the second worst season in CDL history, and he was pretty much the only constant on that team for the entire season, and it seems like he might be sticking with the team moving forward. And I believe they're shaking up like their coaching staff and front office staff as well. And who knows with like just the entire organization in general. But any thoughts on the Vancouver and Boston stuff?
Yeah, I think the Boston situation, both of these really, we're gonna have to wait to hear more
Yeah.
on. Obviously, with Vancouver there, that's contingent upon the LAT super team going through, or just LAT making moves and not retaining Nasty and Kremp, because obviously, just for the sake of an example here, if Gentle Mate swoops in and steals the super team from LAT, I wouldn't, be surprised if LAT decided to keep some of those guys like Nasty and Kremp who were on their team to end this past season. So we're gonna have to wait and see how that plays out. And then Boston, just the most interesting thing to me is like we heard that report very early in the offseason of Boston potentially exiting the CDL. I know I was pretty outspoken, just in terms of being upset that they would potentially be leaving because talked about them being like one of the only franchises to host events back to back years, and they were doing it so quickly after they just entered the league. Like they seemed passionate and eager to be in the league. So losing a team like that, especially in an ecosystem where we've had other organizations say they'll host an event and then have to back out for various reasons, to lose a team that was willing to host these events back to back years, that would have been a pretty big blow in my opinion. So if they are able to come back and then stick in the league, we'll have to wait and see how that all shakes out. But would really like them to stick around. Sticking with that EWC roster feels like it would be just like a budget play. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, in theory, probably wouldn't be spending very much on that roster, but I do think, um, given the potential of them seemingly being very close, if not almost out of the league, to sticking with a low budget roster, I think I'll take them sticking with a low budget roster if the alternative was them just leaving entirely. So we'll have to see how both of those situations play out. But yeah, kind of like we were saying right before we went live, we had a lot to talk about in this episode, but it is all a bunch of reports
Mm-hmm.
and rumors. Really, just nothing is confirmed yet. So the wheels are turning on RosterMania, but we haven't really had that first major domino officially fall. And then once that happens, which it feels like it's going to be Scrap or Hydra, either together or separately, whatever it is, one of them, both potentially on the same team. That first major domino falls, and that's going to start just a chain reaction for everything. So we just got to wait for that to officially kick in, and then we should have a lot more stuff to talk about with more certainty.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like other than the Falcons, being an all Saudi team, but like FaZe and Optic seemed like, okay, we're above right now. Like we're not doing anything. We're sticking with our teams.
Yep.
And then everyone else is like, all hands on deck. We are completely obliterating our team. Everybody like, we're moving. We're get the moving trucks. And I mean, it's cool. Like it's fun. But who knows when we'll actually get something like concrete to talk about, because we really, before like, I don't know, Tuesday this week, we really didn't have much to talk about over the past like few weeks, and then everything started happening all at once, which seems like that's the case with this roster mania. It's like there's nothing, and then a bunch, and then there's probably a little bit of period of nothing again, and we'll see how things work out and shake out, and how these rosters end up absolutely changing over the next probably week or two. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening and watching on. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and at Ego Chall Podcast. Not sure when the next show will be, of course, off season. We're still playing it by ear, but we hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we will be back hopefully soon to talk about more roster mania stuff and anything related to the Call of Duty League. But yeah, Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys as always for all the support. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode, and sort of similar to previous years with us, it's a little more sporadic in the off season than our regular guaranteed weekly shows during the actual season. But like I was just saying a couple minutes ago, hopefully we get that first confirmed move, and then the wheels start really turning, and we'll have more to talk about from you guys. So stay tuned. Should be coming soon, and yeah, hopefully you'll be here when we're breaking it down for you. So thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chow.